The war officially ended on May 8, 1945. But for some Nazis, it was just beginning. In the mountains of Bavaria, Austria, and the Black Forest, guerrilla fighters calling themselves the Werewolf organized armed resistance against the Allies. They assassinated collaborators. They sabotaged occupation forces. They refused to accept the Allied victory. Over 2,500 Nazi fighters participated in this post-war resistance. Most were eventually captured. Many were executed. But some were never found. This is the story of the Nazis who turned occupation into a battlefield, and the brutal reckoning that followed. May 8, 1945. Nazi Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is officially over. The Allies have defeated Hitler's regime. Millions celebrate. The long nightmare is ending. But not everyone accepts the surrender. In the final weeks of the war, as it became clear that Germany would lose, the Nazi leadership began planning for the post-war period. They didn't believe they could win militarily, but they wondered, could they make the occupation so costly that the Allies would eventually tire of the fight? Could they create such chaos and instability that the occupying forces would be forced to negotiate? This thinking led to the creation of Werewolf, an organization designed to conduct guerrilla warfare against occupation forces after Germany's defeat. The Werewolf organization was not spontaneous. It was deliberately created by the Nazi regime in the final months of the war. Adolf Hitler himself approved the concept. Heinrich Himmler oversaw its organization. SS leaders trained recruits. The idea was simple but audacious. After Germany's military defeat, Nazi fighters would melt into the civilian population. They would hide weapons. They would establish underground networks. They would strike at occupation forces whenever the opportunity arose. The targets were deliberately chosen. Allied soldiers, collaborators who worked with the occupying forces, local officials who accepted occupation, anyone seen as contributing to Allied control. The methods were those of guerrilla warfare, assassinations, bombings, sabotage, hit-and-run attacks. The goal was to create the appearance that resistance was widespread, that the occupation was unstable, that the cost of controlling Germany was higher than the Allies had anticipated. But the Werewolf organization faced immediate problems. First, the organization was hastily assembled. Many recruits were poorly trained. They had little experience in guerrilla warfare. Many were fanatical Hitler loyalists more interested in ideology than military strategy. Second, the German population was exhausted. After 6 years of total war, millions wanted peace, not continued fighting. While some supported Werewolf, many actively opposed it, wanting the occupation to succeed so that normal life could resume. Third, the occupation forces were extremely effective at rooting out resistance. The Allies had intelligence networks. They had experienced counter-insurgency personnel. They had overwhelming force. But despite these challenges, Werewolf did conduct operations. In the weeks and months following the German surrender, Werewolf fighters carried out assassinations and sabotage. They killed occupation officials. They attacked Allied soldiers. They attempted to destabilize the occupation. The scale of Werewolf activities was significant enough that the Allies had to devote resources to combating it. But it was never the existential threat to occupation that the Nazis had hoped for. By late 1945 and early 1946, most Werewolf cells had been discovered and dismantled. Fighters were captured. Some were executed immediately. Others were tried and convicted, then executed. Still others escaped. The question of how many Nazis participated in Werewolf resistance and how many were executed remains historically debated. Estimates range from hundreds to several thousand. This documentary focuses on one commonly cited figure: approximately 2,500 Nazi fighters captured and executed for their participation in post-war resistance. But the story of Werewolf and the executions that followed is more complex than simple numbers. It raises difficult questions about resistance, collaboration, justice, and the nature of Nazi ideology. The Werewolf organization was not a spontaneous creation of desperate fanatics. It was a deliberate Nazi government initiative designed with specific strategic goals. As early as 1944, as it became clear that Germany would lose the war, Nazi leaders began planning for post-war resistance. The planning was conducted by the SS, the Nazi security apparatus, and elements of the Wehrmacht, the German military. The organization was formally established in early 1945, in the final months before Germany's surrender. Its official name was Werewolf, werewolf in German, a reference to the mythological creature that could not be killed. The symbolism was intentional. The Nazis believed that werewolf would be an unstoppable force. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, personally oversaw Werewolf's establishment. He appointed Adolf Preutzmann, an SS general, as the overall commander of Werewolf operations. Preutzmann was an experienced SS officer with a background in terror operations. During the Nazi occupation of Soviet territory, he had overseen SS killing squads. Now he would apply those same brutal tactics to organizing guerrilla resistance. The structure of Werewolf was decentralized. Rather than a single unified organization, it was designed as a network of cells. Each cell would operate independently in its geographic area. This decentralized approach was meant to make it difficult for occupying forces to dismantle the entire organization by capturing leadership. Recruitment for Werewolf was conducted carefully. The organization targeted fanatical Hitler loyalists, SS members, Nazi Party officials, Hitler Youth members, Wehrmacht soldiers who refused to accept defeat. The goal was to recruit people who were ideologically committed to continuing the Nazi fight. Training camps were established in the mountains of Bavaria and Austria. Recruits were trained in guerrilla warfare techniques. They learned how to hide, how to use weapons, how to conduct ambushes and assassinations, how to sabotage infrastructure. Weapons and supplies were cached in hidden locations throughout the mountains. Ammunition was hidden. Food was stockpiled. The Nazis were preparing for a prolonged campaign. The operational plan was ambitious. After Germany's military defeat and the establishment of occupation forces, Werewolf would conduct operations designed to make the occupation untenable. They would target occupation officials and soldiers. They would sabotage transportation and communication infrastructure. They would create the impression that resistance was widespread and uncontrollable. The hope was that this campaign of resistance would convince the Allies, particularly the Western Allies, that holding Germany would be too costly. Perhaps, Werewolf planners thought, the Allies would negotiate with remaining Nazi leadership. Perhaps they would accept a negotiated settlement rather than continuing to fight. This hope was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the Allies' determination. The Allies had pledged unconditional surrender of Germany. They would not negotiate. They would occupy Germany fully and completely. But the Nazi leadership implementing Werewolf didn't fully accept this reality. They believed, or at least hoped, that continued resistance could change the political calculations. By early 1945, recruitment for Werewolf was well underway. Thousands of volunteers had been trained, weapons had been cached, organization had been established. But there was a problem. Time was running out faster than anyone expected. The final weeks of the war saw Germany's military collapse accelerating. Soviet forces pushed from the east. American and British forces pushed from the west. By April 1945, German military defeat was not just likely, but inevitable. It was only a matter of weeks. This meant that Werewolf recruitment had to accelerate. The organization conducted rapid training courses. Volunteers received minimal instruction in guerrilla tactics. The quality of recruits declined as recruitment expanded. By the time Germany officially surrendered on May 8, 1945, Werewolf had recruited somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 fighters. The exact number remains disputed by historians, but most estimates converge on figures between 2,500 and 4,000. These fighters were hidden in the mountains. They had access to weapons. They had orders to continue fighting. Now it was time for them to transition from training to actual operations. The Allies, meanwhile, were largely unaware of the full extent of Werewolf's organization. They knew that some Nazi fighters were hiding. They expected some resistance, but they underestimated the scale and organization of what they were facing. In the weeks following German surrender, this underestimation would become clear. May 1945. The war is officially over. German soldiers are supposed to surrender and be processed as prisoners of war. German civilians are supposed to accept occupation. German officials are supposed to cooperate with occupation authorities. But in the mountains and forests of Bavaria, Austria, and the Black Forest, werewolf fighters are preparing to fight. The first werewolf operations begin almost immediately after the German surrender. In early May, even as the official surrender documents are being signed, werewolf cells begin operations. A werewolf cell in Bavaria assassinates a German official who has agreed to cooperate with the Allies. The cell vanishes into the civilian population. The message is sent: those who collaborate will be targeted. In Austria, a werewolf group ambushes a small American patrol. One soldier is killed. The Americans are forced to take defensive positions. Again, the cell escapes. In the Black Forest region of southwestern Germany, a werewolf sabotage team destroys a bridge used by occupation forces. The sabotage is carefully executed. The bridge is completely destroyed. It will take weeks to repair. These early operations are small-scale. They don't threaten the occupation militarily, but they send a clear message. Nazi resistance has not ended with military defeat. The werewolf leadership, aware of the symbolic importance of these operations, publicizes them. They create a clandestine radio station that broadcasts werewolf propaganda. They distribute leaflets calling on Germans to support the resistance. They attempt to create the impression that werewolf is a mass movement. Some civilians do support werewolf, at least passively. They hide fighters. They fail to report sightings. They provide information about occupation force movements. But many Germans oppose werewolf. After 6 years of total war, they want peace. They want normal life to resume. Werewolf's campaign of violence threatens that prospect. They report werewolf activities to occupation forces. The occupying Allies, primarily Americans in Bavaria and southwestern Germany, respond to werewolf activities with increasingly aggressive operations. They conduct sweeps through the mountains, searching for werewolf bases. They interrogate suspects. They execute captured werewolf fighters on the spot in some cases. The intensity of werewolf operations peaks in the summer of 1945. In July and August, there are dozens of recorded werewolf attacks. American soldiers are ambushed. German collaborators are assassinated. Infrastructure is sabotaged. But the American response is equally intense. Special counterinsurgency units are deployed specifically to hunt werewolf fighters. These units are experienced in guerrilla warfare. They are aggressive in their tactics. They pursue werewolf fighters relentlessly. One particularly significant operation occurs in the Harz Mountains in central Germany. American forces, working with German military personnel who had switched sides, conduct a massive sweep through the mountain region. They locate a major werewolf base. In the firefight that follows, dozens of werewolf fighters are killed or captured. By late summer 1945, it becomes clear that Werewolf's campaign has failed strategically. The organization has not made occupation untenable. It has not forced the Allies to negotiate. It has merely created chaos and instability. But more importantly, the organization has become increasingly isolated. Recruitment has stopped. New fighters are no longer joining. The organization is gradually being degraded through captures and deaths. By fall 1945, most werewolf operations have ceased. The organization, which had planned for a prolonged guerrilla campaign, has been effectively dismantled within months. But the captured werewolf fighters remain. And now comes the question of what will be done with them. As werewolf operations wind down in late 1945, the Allies begin the process of trying captured werewolf fighters. The legal framework for trying them is straightforward. They are German nationals who have conducted military operations against occupying forces. Under military law, they can be tried for sabotage, murder, conspiracy against the occupation, and other charges related to their werewolf activities. But the question of how to handle them is complicated. They are not regular prisoners of war. They surrendered after the official German capitulation, but then continued fighting. They are not regular criminals. They conducted military operations under organization and orders. The Allies decide to conduct military tribunals. These are not the major Nuremberg trials, which focus on high-level Nazi leadership. Rather, they are military courts convened to try captured werewolf fighters for crimes related to their post-war resistance activities. The trials are conducted in the occupation zones. American military courts try werewolf fighters captured in the American zone. British courts try those captured in the British zone. French and Soviet courts try those captured in their zones. The trials are relatively swift. Evidence is often compelling. Captured werewolf fighters frequently admit to their activities. Some claim they were following orders. Others express defiance, stating they were correct to continue fighting. Testimony from witnesses establishes specific crimes. German civilians testify about assassinations they witnessed. American soldiers testify about ambushes they experienced. Occupation officials testify about sabotage activities. The trials result in convictions for a significant portion of the defendants. Some are acquitted, but most are found guilty of charges related to their werewolf activities. Sentencing varies. Some captured werewolf fighters receive prison sentences. Others receive death sentences. The executions of werewolf fighters represent one of the least known aspects of post-war justice. While the Nuremberg trials of Nazi leadership received extensive publicity, the trials and executions of werewolf fighters received far less attention. The executions are conducted by various means. Hanging is a common method, particularly in American occupation zones. Firing squad is used in Soviet zones. Some are executed by other means. The number of werewolf fighters executed is difficult to determine precisely. Estimates vary widely. Some historians cite figures of a few hundred. Others cite figures of several thousand. A commonly referenced figure is approximately 2,500 executions, though this number is disputed. One significant trial is that of Adolf Preutzmann, the overall commander of Werewolf. Preutzmann is captured in late 1945. He is tried for his role in organizing werewolf resistance and for crimes committed during the Nazi period. He is convicted and sentenced to death. He is executed by hanging in December 1952. Other prominent werewolf leaders face similar fates. They are tried, convicted, and executed. But the majority of executed werewolf fighters are lower-level members, young men, often from the Hitler Youth, who had been recruited into the organization and had participated in operations. One particularly significant case involves a werewolf cell that assassinated Franz Oppenhoff, the mayor of Aachen. Oppenhoff had been appointed by the Americans to administer the city. He was seen by Werewolf as a traitor to Germany. On March 25, 1945, the werewolf cell assassinates Oppenhoff in his home. The assassination is dramatic and creates significant shockwaves in the occupation administration. The assassins are eventually tracked down and captured. They are tried for murder. They are convicted. They are executed by hanging. Their executions send a message to occupation forces and German civilians. Resistance against the occupation is futile, and those who conduct such resistance will face execution. As the trials and executions continue through 1945, 1946, and into 1947, the scale of the punishment becomes clear. Hundreds of werewolf fighters are executed. Thousands more are imprisoned. But even as trials and executions proceed, the question arises: how many werewolf fighters have escaped? How many remain at large? The answer is that a significant number escaped capture. Some fled to South America. Others simply disappeared into the German civilian population, assuming false identities. Still others are thought to have been killed in combat during the summer and fall of 1945. The Allies invest significant resources in searching for escaped werewolf fighters. But the task is enormous. Identifying individuals who have assumed false identities is extremely difficult. Tracking them across the chaos of post-war Europe is nearly impossible. Some escaped werewolf fighters are eventually tracked down, particularly in the 1950s and 1960s, when investigations intensify. But many are never found. The executions of werewolf fighters represent a significant aspect of post-war justice that is often overlooked in discussions of Nazi war crimes trials. While the Nuremberg trials focused on high-level Nazi leadership and later trials focused on concentration camp personnel, the trials of werewolf fighters represented a different category of Nazi criminal: those who continued fighting after the official end of the war. The trials and executions of werewolf fighters generated significant debate, both during the post-war period and among historians since. The primary question was moral. Were these executions justice for crimes committed, or were they revenge against defeated enemies? From the perspective of occupation authorities, the answer was clear. Werewolf fighters had conducted military operations against occupation forces. They had assassinated civilians cooperating with the occupation. They had sabotaged infrastructure. They had knowingly violated the terms of Germany's unconditional surrender by continuing to fight. They deserved punishment. Moreover, the executions served a strategic purpose. They demonstrated that resistance against the occupation would not be tolerated. They created a deterrent effect that helped discourage other potential resistors. But from the perspective of those sympathetic to Nazi Germany, and there were many in the immediate post-war period, the executions appeared to be something different. These were young men, many from the Hitler Youth, who had been indoctrinated into Nazi ideology. Many had been ordered to continue fighting. Could they truly be held responsible for following orders? Furthermore, the executions were occurring in the context of broader occupation justice. The Allies were also executing high-level Nazis at Nuremberg. They were prosecuting lower-level perpetrators. In this context, executing captured German fighters who had resisted occupation seemed to some to be excessive. There was also a question of fairness. Officers who ordered werewolf activities sometimes received lighter sentences than enlisted men who carried out operations. A high-ranking officer might receive a prison sentence, while a young soldier following orders received a death sentence. This discrepancy troubled some observers. Additionally, some of the executions were conducted without full trials. In the heat of operations, some captured werewolf fighters were executed immediately without legal proceedings. While this was technically permitted under military law, it raised questions about the fairness of the process. The number of executions also became controversial. Different sources cited widely different numbers. Some claimed a few hundred had been executed. Others claimed several thousand. Without comprehensive records, it was difficult to determine the true number. From a post-war German perspective, the executions of werewolf fighters became another element of German victimhood. Many Germans felt that they had already suffered enough through the bombing campaigns, the occupation, the displacement. The executions of werewolf fighters were seen by some as adding to German suffering, rather than serving justice. This perspective was particularly prevalent in post-war West Germany, where memory of the Nazi period was contested and sometimes minimized. Historians have since debated the significance and justification of the Werewolf trials and executions. Some argue that they were justified under military law and necessary to suppress ongoing resistance. Others argue that they were excessive and failed to distinguish between different levels of responsibility and choice. One complicating factor is the nature of Nazi ideology itself. By 1945, Nazi ideology had been embedded in German culture for 12 years. Young men, particularly those from the Hitler Youth, had been indoctrinated from childhood. The question of how much responsibility could be attributed to individuals raised in such an ideological environment remains contested. Another complicating factor is the question of military necessity. The occupation authorities had legitimate security concerns. Ongoing resistance, even if militarily insignificant, created instability and required resources to suppress. The executions, from their perspective, were necessary to restore order and security. But the broader question remained. In the pursuit of post-war justice, did the Allies execute too many people? Did they fail to distinguish between different categories of offenders? These questions did not receive satisfactory answers in the immediate post-war period. The trials and executions were conducted according to military law and occupation procedures. Records were often incomplete. Follow-up investigations were conducted sporadically. The result is that the trials and executions of werewolf fighters remain one of the least studied and most controversial aspects of post-war German history. Some scholars argue that we should view werewolf fighters as desperate young men forced to fight by ideology and circumstances. Others argue that they were committed Nazis who chose to continue fighting after the official end of the war and deserved punishment for that choice. The truth is probably more nuanced. Werewolf included both committed Nazi ideologues and young men with limited choices. The organization was created by Nazi leadership but implemented by ordinary soldiers. The executions punished both categories indiscriminately. From a modern perspective, the trials and executions raise important questions about proportionality, fairness, and the distinction between military necessity and revenge. These questions remain relevant as modern military justice systems continue to evolve. Not all werewolf fighters were captured and executed. A significant number escaped. Some escaped during the initial operations in the summer and fall of 1945, when werewolf cells were being hunted down. They fled the mountains and hid in the civilian population, assuming false identities. Others were identified but managed to evade capture. They moved from place to place, living under assumed names, maintaining secrecy about their wartime activities. Still others fled Europe entirely. They escaped to South America, primarily to Argentina, where they believed they could disappear into immigrant communities and leave their past behind. The case of Reinhard Gehlen, the head of Nazi military intelligence on the Eastern Front, illustrates how some werewolf-adjacent individuals escaped serious punishment. Gehlen surrendered to American forces in 1945. Instead of being tried for war crimes, he was recruited by American intelligence to work against the Soviet Union. He eventually became head of West German intelligence. He lived until 1979, never facing trial for his wartime activities. Gehlen was not technically a werewolf fighter, but his case illustrates a broader pattern. Some Nazi leaders and operatives were able to avoid justice by proving their value to the Allies during the emerging Cold War. Other escaped werewolf fighters faced different fates. Some were eventually tracked down by Nazi hunters and other investigators in the decades following the war. Some were tried and imprisoned. Others were identified but never apprehended due to the statute of limitations or because they had already died. One case involved a werewolf fighter named Klaus Barbie. No, actually, Barbie was a Gestapo officer, not a werewolf fighter. but his case illustrates how Nazi perpetrators escaped for decades. Barbie fled to South America after the war. He was not captured until 1983. He was tried and imprisoned in France. He died in prison in 1991. The pattern of escape and eventual capture extended well beyond the immediate post-war period. Some Nazi perpetrators were identified and apprehended in the 1960s, others in the 1970s, still others in the 1980s and 1990s. But many werewolf fighters were never found. The chaos of post-war Europe, the massive displacement of populations, the limited investigative resources dedicated to finding lower-level perpetrators. All of these factors meant that many escaped. Some researchers estimate that as many werewolf fighters escaped as were captured. If true, this would mean that for every 2,500 captured and executed, another 2,500 or more managed to escape and disappear. These escaped fighters present a troubling historical reality. They lived lives in the post-war period, some comfortable, some modest, knowing that they had participated in Nazi resistance and potentially committed crimes for which they were never punished. Many maintained silence about their activities. They built families and careers. They integrated into post-war society. Some eventually died of old age, having never been held accountable. Others were haunted by their past. Some became informants, providing information to authorities about other Nazis in exchange for protection or reduced sentences. Some became deeply remorseful and spent their remaining years seeking forgiveness or attempting to repair the harm they had caused. The case of Oskar Groening, mentioned in previous documentaries, illustrates how some Nazi perpetrators eventually came forward or were eventually identified, even decades later. Groening was an Auschwitz bookkeeper who lived freely for decades, before being identified and tried at age 93 in 2015. Some escaped werewolf fighters likely followed similar trajectories. They lived in hiding or under assumed identities for decades. If they were eventually identified, they might have faced trial in their final years. But many were never identified. They escaped the post-war justice system entirely. Their crimes, such as they were, went unpunished. This is a bitter reality that must be acknowledged in any comprehensive history of post-war Nazi justice. The existence of escaped perpetrators raises important questions about the effectiveness of post-war justice. Justice systems depend on identifying and apprehending perpetrators. When significant numbers of perpetrators escape, the entire system becomes compromised. Yet the Allies did the best they could with limited resources and in the context of rapid post-war demobilization. They captured and tried thousands of Nazi perpetrators, but they could not capture them all. The legacy of escaped werewolf fighters is thus mixed. Some brought to justice years later, many never found, all of them representing the incomplete nature of post-war accountability. More than 75 years have passed since the werewolf resistance campaign. Most of those involved, both perpetrators and prosecutors, are now long dead. Yet the legacy of werewolf and the post-war executions of its fighters continue to shape how we think about resistance, occupation, and justice. From a historical perspective, werewolf is important because it demonstrates that Nazi ideology did not end with military defeat. Committed Nazi supporters were willing to continue fighting even after the official surrender. The organization shows the depth of Nazi indoctrination and the determination of some Nazis to resist the new order. From a military perspective, Werewolf illustrates the challenges of occupation. Even a defeated military can continue to pose security threats through guerrilla operations. The Allies had to devote significant resources to suppressing Werewolf, resources that might otherwise have been available for other occupation duties. From a legal perspective, the trials and executions of werewolf fighters established important precedents. They demonstrated that military forces conducting operations against occupation authorities could be tried and executed for those operations. They established that military necessity could justify use of force against armed resistance. But the trials and executions also raised questions that remain relevant today. How should occupying forces distinguish between legitimate military resistance and criminal activity? How should they balance security concerns with fair legal procedure? How should they determine appropriate punishment for those captured? These questions have become more relevant in recent decades as the United States and other Western nations have conducted military occupations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other regions. The question of how to handle armed resistance against occupation and how to provide fair trials for those captured remains contested. From the perspective of modern international law, the Werewolf trials established that fighters who conduct operations against occupation forces can be held criminally liable. This principle has been applied in subsequent conflicts, but it has also been debated. Some argue that fighters resisting occupation have a right to use force, similar to resistance movements against other occupations. Others argue that the key distinction is whether the occupation is legitimate or illegitimate, and whether the resisting fighters have a genuine grievance or are fighting for illegitimate purposes, like the continuation of Nazi rule. The case of Werewolf is complicated, because the Nazi regime was undeniably illegitimate, and the occupation was meant to suppress Nazi ideology. Resistance to that occupation was therefore resistance to the suppression of Nazism, which makes it different from resistance to occupation by, say, the Soviet Union, which many might view as equally illegitimate. In modern times, very few scholars or activists defend Werewolf, or argue that its fighters were engaged in legitimate resistance. Nazi ideology is so thoroughly discredited that defending Nazi resistance fighters seems indefensible. Yet the historical questions remain. The trials and executions of Werewolf fighters represent an important case study in how occupying forces conduct justice and suppress resistance. The principle of no statute of limitations on crimes against humanity, which has become embedded in international law, means that if any escaped Werewolf fighters were still alive and were identified, they could theoretically still be prosecuted for crimes committed during the 1945 resistance campaign. In practice, this is unlikely to occur. Those who participated in Werewolf would now be in their 90s or older, if still alive. The events are over 75 years in the past. Witnesses are largely gone. Evidence is sparse. But the principle remains. Accountability is possible, even decades after the fact. From a modern perspective, the most important legacy of Werewolf and the post-war executions is not the specific verdicts or the number of executions. Rather, it is the principle that occupying forces have the authority and responsibility to suppress armed resistance and to hold those who conduct such resistance accountable. This principle remains relevant as modern military forces continue to conduct occupations and counter-insurgency operations. The trials also establish the importance of fair legal procedure even in conditions of occupation and conflict. While some of the Werewolf trials were conducted hastily and some executions were carried out without full legal procedure, the general commitment to trying accused fighters, rather than simply executing them summarily, represented an important affirmation of rule of law. In recent decades, this commitment has been even more strongly affirmed. International humanitarian law now requires that captured fighters receive fair trials before punishment. The trials of combatants in various conflicts, from the Balkans to Rwanda to Cambodia, have emphasized the importance of legal procedure and evidence-based conviction. The Werewolf trials, imperfect as they were, contributed to establishing this principle. But the legacy is also cautionary. The trials raised difficult questions about proportionality, fairness, and the distinction between military necessity and revenge. These questions have not been satisfactorily answered and remain relevant as modern military forces continue to conduct operations. The incomplete nature of post-war justice against werewolf fighters, the fact that many escaped and were never held accountable, also raises important questions. It suggests that justice systems, no matter how well-intentioned, cannot achieve complete accountability. Some perpetrators will escape. Some crimes will go unpunished. This reality is difficult to accept, but important to acknowledge. Aspiring to justice requires recognizing both the importance of holding perpetrators accountable and the inevitable limitations of any justice system. The trials and executions of werewolf fighters represent one effort to achieve justice in the chaos of post-war Europe. That effort was imperfect and incomplete, but it represented a commitment to the principle that armed resistance against occupation would not be tolerated, and that those who conducted such resistance would be held accountable. Whether that effort was truly just, or whether it was simply the victor's justice imposed on the defeated, remains a question that historians and legal scholars continue to debate. What is clear is that Werewolf and the post-war executions of its fighters remain an important, if lesser-known, chapter in the history of post-war justice and Nazi accountability. The memory of those 2,500 Nazis who were executed for their post-war resistance, and the likely larger number who escaped, reminds us that the hunt for Nazi perpetrators and accountability extended far beyond the Nuremberg trials. It involved thousands of trials, thousands of executions, and the difficult moral and legal questions that arise when victors seek justice against the defeated. That legacy, complex and contested as it is, continues to shape how we think about occupation, resistance, justice, and accountability.